The millionaire laughed so loud the crowd joined in. "My company's yours if you can outrun me with that junk," he said, pointing at the old man and his rusty car. Everyone expected humiliation. No one expected redemption. Because what began as a cruel bet would soon become a race that changed both their lives forever. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? The morning heat shimmered over the wide parking lot of Grayson Motors, wrapping the Knoxville air in a haze of oil, asphalt, and pride. The red Ferrari roared once before falling silent, its polished body catching the sunlight like a mirror. From the driver's seat stepped Elliot Grayson, the company's 36-year-old CEO, dressed in a crisp gray suit that looked as if it had never known sweat or worry. He locked the car with a sharp click, his reflection flashing in the tinted window. Every head nearby turned. Workers nodded, some smiled politely. Elliot liked the tiny silence that followed him. It was the sound of power, the same silence his father used to command. But today, that silence broke. Parked squarely beside the Ferrari in the very space marked executive office only, sat an ancient 1930 Cadillac paint-chipped chrome dull body sagging with time. It looked like it had driven straight out of a museum and into the wrong century. Elliot stopped mid-stride. For a moment, even the hum of air conditioners seemed to fade. "Who parked that junk here?" he asked aloud, voice cutting through the heat. A few employees exchanged looks, half curious, half afraid. Then a sound came, the soft jingle of keys. Out from the far side of the lot walked Walter Dean, the company's oldest janitor, a tall, thin man in his 70s, skin the color of rich earth, wearing an old blue uniform and holding a towel tucked into his belt. His steps were slow but sure, a rhythm carved by years of steady work and quiet endurance. He didn't hurry, didn't flinch under the stairs. He simply walked to the Cadillac, wiped a streak of dust off the hood, and checked the side mirror. Elliot folded his arms. "You parked here?" Walter looked up through his glasses. "All the other spaces were full, sir." Elliot let out a short laugh. "You thought this rusty thing belongs next to my Ferrari?" The crowd behind them stirred. Phones came out. Whispers grew. Everyone knew that tone. The boss was about to make a point. Walter only adjusted his glasses and said calm as Sunday morning didn't see a sign with your name on it. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Elliot's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Do you know who owns this company?" Walter's eyes didn't waver. Doesn't change where the open space was. The air between them thickened. Somewhere a mechanic muttered, "Oh, this is going to get good." Elliot straightened, letting his voice carry. "Tell you what, since you think that relic deserves a spot next to mine, let's make it fair. You and me, a race. If that old heap beats my Ferrari, the space is yours." Gasps spread through the lot. Someone snickered. Another whispered, "He's serious." Elliot smirked. "In fact," he said louder, turning for the cameras now raised, "if that Cadillac outruns me, you can have the company." For a man used to control, Elliot didn't realize he'd just lost it. Walter blinked slowly, as though weighing more than a car race. "You sure about that, son?" Elliot crossed his arms. "Absolutely." Walter gave a small shrug. "All right then." And just like that, the challenge was set. The rumor spread before the engines even started. The young CEO of Grayson Motors had just challenged his janitor to a race under the Tennessee sun. By the time both cars rolled to the far end of the lot, the crowd had doubled. Workers leaned out of windows. Managers stood beside interns. Even the receptionist held up her phone, ready to record what no one would believe later. The air buzzed with heat and anticipation. Walter lifted the Cadillac's hood, and the smell of old gasoline drifted out like a ghost from another era. He tightened a strap, checked a valve, and pressed a hose clamp back into place. His hands moved with the confidence of habit, slow, steady, without fear. Elliot strutted around his Ferrari, all charm and arrogance. "Look at her," he said to no one in particular. 0 to 60 in just over 3 seconds. "You sure you want to do this?" Mr. Dean Walter didn't answer. He just wiped his hands on his towel and closed the hood with a gentle click. "Let's find out." A young woman from HR raised her arm. "All right, gentlemen, on my mark." Engines growled. The Ferrari's roar filled the lot. The Cadillac's hum barely registered. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He's going to get smoked." 3, 2, 1, go. Elliot's Ferrari leapt forward like lightning, tires screaming. The crowd erupted in cheers. Dust spiraled behind him as the bright red car tore down the straightaway. Walter's Cadillac rolled forward at its own rhythm, patient, steady, unbothered by the noise. People laughed. "He's not even racing," one shouted. But Walter wasn't there to prove speed. He was there to show something else. Halfway down the stretch, the Ferrari's roar faltered. Elliot frowned, tapping the gas. A warning light blinked red on the dashboard, engine temp high. Then came a sputter, a cough, and silence. The car shuddered to a stop in the middle of the lane, smoke curling from beneath the hood. The crowd gasped. "No way," someone whispered. Elliot slammed the steering wheel, disbelief hardening his face. He climbed out, the summer air thick around him, the smell of burnt rubber rising. And then came the hum, low, smooth, ancient but alive. Walter's Cadillac rolled past the stalled Ferrari, slow and sure. He didn't glance sideways, didn't smirk. He simply drove through the heat, through the disbelief, through every phone camera capturing what pride had just undone. When he crossed the finish line, he eased the car to a stop. The crowd fell silent. Walter stepped out, towel in hand, as if he'd just finished cleaning a hallway. He walked back toward the Ferrari, stopping a few feet away. Elliot stood there, sweat beading on his forehead, his tie loosened, his pride cracked open for everyone to see. Walter looked at him, voice quiet but carrying through the still air. "Need a lift?" A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, but there was no mockery in it, only astonishment. Walter rested his hand lightly on the Cadillac's door. "Race isn't over till you get home, son." Elliot said nothing. For the first time, words failed him. The man he'd mocked, the man who swept his floors, now stood taller than he ever had. As Walter turned back toward the building, the Cadillac's keys jingled softly, and the crowd parted to let him pass. The hot air shimmered around him, turning the moment almost dreamlike. Elliot watched him go, standing beside a car that wouldn't start, and a company suddenly feeling much smaller than it had that morning. He didn't know it yet, but this was the day everything would begin to change, not just his career, not just his reputation, but the very definition of what power meant. And under the Tennessee sun, as the crowd dispersed and whispers grew into legend, Grayson Motors quietly took its first step toward redemption. By morning, the story had already grown its own legs. The janitor and the CEO, the Cadillac and the Ferrari. The headlines wrote themselves, at least that's what the interns whispered over coffee. Every corner of Grayson Motors buzzed with it. The security guards replayed the footage like a highlight reel. Engineers laughed in disbelief. And office assistants traded theories about whether the old man had some secret engine under that antique hood. Elliot Grayson didn't laugh. He spent most of the morning in silence, blinds half closed, watching the replay in his office over and over again. The image haunted him the moment the Ferrari stalled, the look on his own face, frozen mid-disbelief, and the quiet strength of Walter Dean driving past without a smirk. His inbox flooded with memes, jokes, and an internal email from Perot politely suggesting they spin the incident as a morale-building event. He deleted it without replying. At noon, he stepped out into the hallway. Conversation stopped. Employees who once scrambled to greet him now stared at their screens, pretending to be busy. Even the receptionist, always cheerful, barely met his eyes. That silence used to feel like power. Now, it felt like distance. He headed down to the test garage where the Ferrari sat under a tarp like a wounded animal. "I want a full diagnostic," he told the head mechanic. The man hesitated. "Already did, sir. Pressure line cracked. Looks like someone patched it before, not replaced." Elliot frowned. Patched? That car's barely a year old. Could have been from a test run maybe, when your father's team still managed the facility, the man offered. The mention of his father made Elliot's chest tighten. "Thank you," he said quietly. When the mechanic left, Elliot stood alone with the car. His reflection wavered in the glossy hood, two versions of himself staring back, the man who demanded perfection and the one who just learned how fragile it really was. He pressed a hand to the metal. "You let me down," he muttered. But deep down he knew it wasn't the car that failed. Outside, Knoxville hummed under the afternoon heat. The city never cared who lost or won. Life went on. That evening, Elliot couldn't bring himself to go home. The mansion felt too big, too empty, and filled with echoes of his father's old advice. "Don't just build engines, son. Build people who believe in them." So he took the elevator down to the basement, a place he hadn't been since his first day as CEO. The air was cooler there, thick with the scent of wax detergent and metal polish. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a radio played faintly an old gospel tune drifting between the hum of mop wheels. Walter Dean was finishing his shift, humming along softly as he cleaned near the maintenance door. His posture carried no bitterness, no gloating, just the steady patience of a man who'd worked too long to be surprised by human pride. Elliot stopped a few feet away. "You've been here a long time," he said, his voice uncertain. Walter didn't turn. 42 years this fall," he replied, rinsing the mop. "Back when your father still walked these floors." Elliot tried to smile. He used to talk about the workers a lot, said they were the backbone of the company. He didn't just talk. Walter said, leaning on the mop handle. He listened too. The words hit harder than Elliot expected. He shifted awkwardly. "Look about the race." Walter lifted a hand, stopping him. "Don't worry, son. I've seen plenty of men try to outrun their own pride. You're not the first." Elliot hesitated. "You could have laughed. Everyone else did." "I don't laugh at lessons," Walter said. "They're too rare these days." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the lights filled the quiet. Then Elliot asked softly, "Why'd you even agree? You could have said no." Walter's eyes twinkled behind his glasses. "Because you reminded me of a man I used to be, thought respect was something you could win instead of earn. But sometimes life lets you learn the hard way." Elliot exhaled, the air heavy in his chest. "You think I'm that man?" Walter smiled faintly. "I think you could be better." Something in those words cracked the wall Elliot had built around himself for years. It wasn't scolding. It wasn't pity. It was truth offered without condition. Walter picked up his bucket, wheeling it toward the elevator. "Clean floors, broken engines. Same principle, son. You fix what's in front of you one piece at a time. Don't rush the job." Elliot nodded slowly. "I'll remember that." As the old man disappeared into the elevator, the doors closing with a soft hiss, Elliot stayed there in the dim hallway, listening to the hum of the lights. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had signed million-dollar deals, now feeling heavier than they ever had. When he finally stepped outside, Knoxville was bathed in twilight. Cicadas sang from the trees, and a soft breeze carried the smell of gasoline and summer grass. Somewhere behind him, deep in the building, the sound of a mop bucket rolled once more, rhythmic, unhurried, steady as a heartbeat. Elliot walked toward his car, the night air cool on his face. He didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, watching the lights of the city flicker like stars caught in asphalt. And though he couldn't explain why, a quiet thought crossed his mind. Maybe this was what his father had meant all along. 2 weeks after the race, Knoxville had already moved on. But Elliot Grayson hadn't. Every morning he still drove past the stretch of road where his Ferrari had died, slowing down without meaning to, watching the faded tire marks on the asphalt. Each time he saw them, a quiet sting pressed behind his ribs. Not shame exactly, but something close to it. A reminder that pride, once it blows a gasket, doesn't start again so easily. Work at Grayson Motors had gone back to normal, at least on the surface. The emails, the meetings, the board memos, all humming like an engine idling in neutral. But there was a shift he couldn't quite name. Workers spoke softer when he passed. The laughter in the halls carried less fear and more warmth. Somehow, one foolish race had done what years of leadership hadn't. It made him human to them? That should have been comforting. It wasn't. So that Saturday morning, when he found himself with nowhere to be and no one to see, Elliot decided to drive. Not the Ferrari that stayed parked, half fixed, half forgotten, but an old pickup from the company lot, the kind his father used to drive on weekends. He didn't have a plan. He followed the road south out of downtown until the city noise thinned into open space and sunlight. By the time he noticed the faded sign, Maple Street Diner, coffee and pie since 1949, he was hungry enough to stop. The diner sat at the corner of a quiet street, chrome edges gleaming like memory. The bell above the door jingled when he stepped inside, letting out a wave of warm air and the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee. A waitress in her 50s looked up from behind the counter. "Morning, on. Sit anywhere you like." He slid into a booth by the window, glancing at the rows of old photographs lining the wall, pictures of local fairs, Vintage cars, baseball teams, and families smiling in front of the diner's door through the years. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. "Please," he said, smiling faintly. She poured it in a chipped mug. "You look like a man with too much on his mind." Elliot laughed under his breath. "That obvious honey. I've been serving coffee for 30 years. I can spot a heavy heart before I even pour." He smiled again, softer this time. "Guess you're right." And then he heard it, that same slow, familiar hum from somewhere behind him, the sound of a voice he knew. When he turned, Walter Dean was sitting 2 booths away, reading a folded newspaper, glasses perched low on his nose. He wore the same blue uniform shirt, though the name tag looked freshly polished. For a second, Elliot froze. Of all the diners in all of Knoxville, this one. He hesitated, then rose, coffee in hand. "Mind if I join you?" Walter looked up, surprised but not unkind. "Seat's open." Elliot sat down across from him, the vinyl seat squeaking. "Didn't take you for a coffee and pie man." Walter smiled. "I'm a pie man before I'm anything else. Keeps the spirits sweet." Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "You ever stop working?" "Only when I've got pie," Walter said, taking another bite. "You trying to learn how?" The old man nodded, as though that was the first honest answer he'd heard in a while. The waitress came by again, dropping off another mug. "You two look like old friends," she said warmly. Walter smiled. "Something like that." When she left, Elliot stared at the window where morning light painted dust in gold. "I've been thinking about that day," he said finally. "The race." Walter folded his paper, still worrying about that. "More like wondering why it hit me so hard," Elliot admitted. "It wasn't just about losing. It was about realizing how little I understood the people I lead." Walter sipped his coffee. "That's a good start. Most men never get that far." Elliot leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You've worked there over 40 years, and I barely knew your name until 2 weeks ago. That's wrong." Walter's eyes softened. "You were busy running a company, son. Sometimes when you're high up, the floor gets blurry." Elliot laughed quietly. "You make it sound like gravity's a choice. It ain't," Walter said. "It just reminds you where you stand." They sat in silence a while, the sound of the diner around them filling the space, silverware clinking, laughter from a table nearby, the hiss of the griddle. Then Walter spoke again. "Your daddy used to sit in that booth." He nodded toward the corner by the jukebox. "Every Sunday morning before church. Coffee, apple pie, same as me. Used to say you can tell a man's heart by how he treats a waitress." Elliot looked over. "You knew him well, didn't you? Well enough to know he'd be proud." "You're sitting here now, instead of pretending that race never happened." Elliot swallowed hard. He'd also say I made a fool of myself. Walter chuckled. "Maybe. But he'd add that the fool who learns something ends up wiser than the man who never stumbles." The simplicity of it sank deep. Outside, sunlight flickered off parked cars, and somewhere a church bell rang 11 times. The smell of pie filled the air, thick with sugar and nostalgia. Elliot exhaled, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. "You ever think some moments are meant to happen? Like the world spins just right so you can see what you've been missing?" Walter smiled. "Every day. Trouble is, most folks don't look up long enough to notice." They talked until the coffee cooled and the morning crowd thinned. When Elliot finally stood to leave, he reached into his pocket and left a 20 under his mug. "Over tip," Walter said, eyebrow raised. "Call it interest," Elliot replied. "I owe you a conversation or two." Walter grinned. "I'll hold you to that." As Elliot stepped outside, the Tennessee sun wrapped him in warmth again, but it didn't feel as harsh this time. The air carried the smell of coffee and summer grass, and the sound of the diner's bell followed him to his truck. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to race anyone. He just drove slow, steady, letting the world move around him. And behind him, through the diner window, Walter watched, smiling faintly, the kind of smile a man gives when he knows the story's just beginning to turn. The summer air in Knoxville hung heavy that Monday morning, thick with humidity and the hum of machines. Inside Grayson Motors, the factory floor echoed with the rhythm of drills and engines, a kind of industrial heartbeat. For the first time in years, Elliot Grayson was there, not in a glass office above it all, but walking the same concrete aisles as the workers. He'd traded his tailored suit for rolled-up sleeves and an old company jacket he found in storage. The look earned him a few curious stares, but mostly quiet respect. People didn't quite know how to act around a boss who suddenly wanted to listen. "Morning, Mr. Grayson," someone called from behind a workbench. He nodded, offering a small smile. "Just Elliot's fine." That simple sentence caught more attention than he realized. Near the far end of the floor, he spotted Walter Dean bent over a large compressor, wiping it down with a rag. The man moved slower these days, but there was precision in every motion, the patience of someone who believed machines were alive in their own quiet way. "Morning." Mr. Dean, Elliot greeted. Walter looked up, squinting through his glasses. "Well, look who decided to get his hands dirty." Elliot laughed, trying to earn back some dignity. Walter smirked. "That's a tall order, son." The two men worked side by side for a while, Walter checking seals, Elliot holding a light. They didn't talk much. The sound of wrenches and the faint gospel tune from Walter's old radio filled the silence comfortably. At one point, Elliot asked, "How long can a machine like this last?" Walter ran a hand along the metal. "As long as you respect what it was built for. Ignore that, and even the strongest engine gives up." Elliot nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand." But just as he said it, Walter's hand slipped. The wrench clattered to the floor, and the old man caught the edge of the workbench to steady himself. "Walter." "I'm fine," he said quickly, but his face had gone pale. Elliot moved closer. "You're not fine. Sit down," I said. Walter started, but his knees buckled. Elliot caught him just in time, easing him onto a nearby stool. The sound of machines dimmed as nearby workers noticed. "Call medical," Elliot shouted. Someone ran for the phone. Another fetched water. Walter's breathing came shallow, his hand trembling as he tried to wave them off. "It's just the heat. Don't make a scene." But it wasn't the heat. Elliot could see the tightness in his chest, the way his pulse fluttered weakly at his wrist. The plant nurse arrived moments later, checking vitals and calling an ambulance. Elliot stayed beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other gripping the towel Walter always carried. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "You're not allowed to check out yet." Walter smiled faintly, though his voice was barely a whisper. "Engines get tired too, son." The ambulance took Walter away under flashing lights, the siren fading into the humid air. The factory stood still long after it left no machines. No chatter, just silence. Elliot remained there, staring at the spot where Walter had collapsed. The towel was still in his hand, damp with oil and sweat. Something inside him twisted a mix of guilt, fear, and the kind of helplessness he'd spent his whole life avoiding. He looked at the faces of his workers, people who'd once feared him, now watching him not as a boss, but as a man. For the first time, their concern wasn't for their CEO, but for the old janitor who'd always treated them kindly. That night, Elliot didn't go home. He drove straight to Knoxville General Hospital, where he found Walter resting hooked up to monitors that beeped in steady rhythm. The nurse said it wasn't a heart attack, but close exhaustion, dehydration, years of overwork. When Walter opened his eyes, Elliot was already there, sitting in a chair by the window. "Guess I made a scene after all," Walter said weakly. "You nearly gave me a heart attack." Elliot replied with a small laugh, though his eyes glistened. "You shouldn't be working those shifts." Walter looked at him for a long moment. "You ever try telling a man to stop doing the one thing that makes him feel useful?" Elliot fell silent. He understood that better than he wanted to admit. Walter shifted slightly. "Don't feel bad, son. Engines fail bodies too. Doesn't mean you stop running the race, just means you learn to take the turns slower." Elliot leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You've spent your life keeping this company alive. It's time I do something for you." Walter chuckled softly. "I don't need anything fancy. Maybe fix that old Cadillac for me. She's been loyal longer than most men I've met." "I'll do more than that," Elliot said firmly. "You've earned it." Walter gave him a long, knowing look. "Careful now. Promises are like engines too, they need maintenance." Elliot smiled. "Then I'll make sure this one runs forever." Outside, the sun dipped below the Knoxville skyline, washing the hospital room in amber light. The rhythmic beep of the monitor sounded almost like an engine at idle calm, as if waiting for the next ignition. Elliot sat back, realizing that for all his years chasing speed and success, this sitting beside a man who'd once humbled him felt like the first time he'd truly stopped. When Walter drifted off to sleep, Elliot placed the towel gently on the nightstand and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." He stepped out into the hallway, the soft hum of machines following him like a song. For the first time in a long while, Elliot didn't feel like running from his past. He felt like repairing it one bolt, one apology, one quiet act at a time. By the time Walter Dean returned home from the hospital, Knoxville had changed its tune. The heavy air of summer was gone, replaced by the soft breath of early autumn. Mornings came with fog curling low over the streets, and the maples near the factory gates began to turn gold and rust. Inside, Grayson Motors, something else had shifted, something quieter, deeper. The workers still clocked in the engines, still roared, the machines still hummed. But the way people looked at each other had changed. Elliot Grayson felt it every time he walked through the main corridor, the same corridor where just months earlier he'd been feared more than followed. Now when he passed, people greeted him by name, some even smiled. It wasn't the old kind of politeness, not the tight smiles of obligation, but something genuine if cautious. Respect maybe, or hope. He had begun showing up before dawn, not to oversee, but to learn. He asked questions about the machines, about the workers' families, about their routines. The first few days, no one believed he was serious. Then, he kept showing up, day after day. "Morning," Grayson, a young mechanic, called one day. Elliot shook his head, smiling faintly. "Just Elliot, please." That answer traveled faster than any memo ever could. Even the board noticed. In less than a month, employee turnover dropped, complaints slowed, and production quality quietly climbed. It wasn't in the charts yet, but anyone on the floor could feel it. The company was breathing again. Still, not everyone approved. The board of directors, suits and ties from a different world, had gathered that Thursday morning in the top-floor conference room, their reflections gleaming in the glass walls that looked down on the factory. Lisa Harper, the chairwoman, called the meeting to order. "We have to discuss Mr. Grayson's direction," she said. "He's shifting policy without prior approval." One of the older men frowned. "He's turning a manufacturing giant into a charity project. These mentorship ideas. Pairing engineers with janitors. What's next?" "Potlucks in the break room." A few chuckled under their breath. But Lisa didn't. She leaned back, eyes calm. "The man's trying to rebuild culture. Something we haven't had since his father passed." Elliot entered the room quietly, not missing a beat of their conversation. "You're right," he said. "We lost our culture the day we decided people were less important than our machines." A hush fell over the table. He walked to the head of the room, his voice steady but low, like someone who'd already faced the worst version of himself and lived to tell about it. "I know you're all worried about numbers," he began. "So was I, for years. But numbers don't build cars, people do. The hands that tighten bolts, the minds that solve problems, the eyes that notice when something's not quite right. We've spent too long ignoring them." One of the board members interjected, "And how does this sentiment help shareholders?" Mr. Grayson Elliot met his gaze. "By reminding them they're investing in people who care. Machines don't stay loyal. Gentlemen, workers do." Lisa folded her hands. I'm proposing Legacy Line," he said. "A mentorship program across every department. Senior staff, not just executives, will guide new hires. Walter Dean will help train the next generation. And maybe in the process, we remember why this company was built in the first place." Someone scoffed quietly. "You want a janitor to mentor engineers?" Elliot didn't flinch. "I want a man who's kept this building alive longer than most of us have been breathing to teach us what that means." Silence again, this time heavier. Lisa's expression softened. "Your father would have liked that idea." Elliot looked out the glass wall toward the floor below, where Walter's blue uniform could be seen moving carefully between the machines, one hand still steadying himself as he worked. "He's the kind of man my father built this place for," he said quietly. "And the kind I almost forgot existed." For the first time in years, the boardroom didn't feel cold. When the meeting adjourned, Lisa stopped him at the door. "Elliot," she said softly, "it takes courage to admit a company needs a soul. Don't lose that now." He nodded, grateful, though a lump caught in his throat. That evening, as twilight settled over Knoxville, Elliot drove across town with a small box resting on the passenger seat. Inside were gleaming Cadillac parts, a new pressure line, fuel pump, spark plugs, all cleaned and polished by hand. A handwritten card sat on top. For your girl, from the shop floor, with respect. He parked in front of Walter's modest house where the porch light glowed faintly through the dusk. The wind chime by the door clattered softly as he climbed the steps. Walter sat outside in his old rocking chair, blanket draped across his lap, the 1930 Cadillac resting like an old friend in the driveway. "Well," Walter said with a grin, "if it isn't the man who finally slowed down." Elliot laughed quietly. "I'm learning from the best." "Ha!" Walter chuckled, motioning toward the box. "What's that you've got there?" "Something that belongs to your girl," Elliot said, setting it down. "Parts the team helped refurbish. They insisted." Walter stared at the box for a long time, his eyes glassy. "They did that for me." Elliot nodded. "They did it because of you." Walter reached inside, lifting the fuel line, the metal catching the porch light like liquid silver. "I'll be damned. These look brand new." "They are," Elliot said softly. "She deserves to run right again." Walter smiled faintly. "So do you, son." They sat in silence for a while, the evening air filled with the smell of cut grass and the soft hum of passing cars. After a moment, Elliot said, "I spoke with Lisa Harper. She wants you back part-time mentoring under the Legacy Line program." Walter chuckled. "You're making me sound important." "You are," Elliot replied. "You've been teaching me since the day I lost that race." Walter rocked gently in his chair. "Funny thing about races, folks think it's about winning, but most times it's about finding out what you're really running toward." Elliot smiled. "And what do you think I've been running from?" Walter gave him a long, knowing look. "Your father's shadow, and maybe your own reflection." Elliot's smile faded. "I miss him, Walter." "More than I ever admitted," I know, Walter said softly. "But he's not gone. Every bolt, every design, every man he treated fair, he's still here in the work. You're just starting to see him again." The porch light flickered as the wind picked up. Elliot leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You ever think some people come into your life just to hold up a mirror?" he asked. Walter chuckled. "Sure, but the trick is looking long enough to see past your own face." They sat together a while longer until the crickets filled the air and the stars blinked awake. The Cadillac gleamed under the porch light, old but proud. As Elliot stood to leave, Walter reached out and squeezed his hand. His grip was firm, steady, warm. "Don't forget what I told you," Walter said. "You can't fix everything at once. But you can start by fixing what's right in front of you." Elliot smiled. "I'll keep that wrench handy." Walter laughed softly. "Good. 'Cause life's a long drive, son. You'll need it." Elliot walked back to his truck. As he started the engine, he looked in the rearview mirror, saw Walter still rocking gently, the wind chime tinkling the old car, gleaming in the driveway like memory itself. He drove off slowly through the quiet streets of Knoxville, the night cool on his face. For the first time in years, the city didn't feel heavy. The air smelled of promise of gasoline, autumn leaves, and redemption, and as he turned onto Maple Street, Elliot realized something simple but profound. Some engines break down, so we remember how to rebuild not just the machines, but ourselves. The first frost of winter touched Knoxville the morning the headlines hit. Grayson Motors under fire, CEO's conduct questioned after viral race incident. The photo below the headline showed Elliot Grayson standing beside Walter Dean. Both captured mid-frame, the young CEO humbled beside the old janitor. The story, recycled and exaggerated, spread faster than truth could catch up. Talk shows called it the fall of a millionaire. Reporters camped outside the gates of Grayson Motors, shouting questions that all sounded the same. "Is it true you offered your company in a race? Are you stepping down, Mr. Grayson?" Elliot said nothing. He kept walking. The more he tried to repair the company's soul, the more the world seemed hungry to tear it apart. Inside, the plant workers shielded him as best they could. "You keep your head up, boss," one said. "We know the truth, but truth wasn't what the cameras wanted." By midweek, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. The tone of the email was clinical, but the message was clear: control the damage or the board will. The conference room that day was cold, not just in temperature, but in mood. The long table gleamed under the fluorescent lights like an operating table waiting for a diagnosis. Lisa Harper sat at the head, her face unreadable. Around her, a dozen men and women murmured in low voices until she raised a hand. "Let's begin." A projector screen flickered to life, showing clips from the viral video. The race, the breakdown, the moment Walter's Cadillac passed the Ferrari. Elliot didn't flinch. He'd seen it too many times. One board member leaned forward, his voice clipped. "You turned this company into a spectacle. Our investors are demanding an explanation." "I gave them one," Elliot said calmly, "and a new reason to believe this company stands for something more than power." Another voice snapped, "Belief doesn't pay dividends." Lisa's tone was softer but sharp. "Elliot, they're right to be concerned. The market reacts to perception. You've been making moral decisions in a financial world." Elliot smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we forgot that our moral engine runs everything else." A few groans circled the room. Then came the ultimatum. Effective immediately, one man said, "We recommend suspension of CEO duties pending a review. It's temporary, for the company's protection." Elliot sat still, the words sinking like heavy bolts into his chest. "And who'll lead in my absence?" Lisa's voice was low. "The board will appoint an interim chair until further review." He exhaled slowly, staring through the glass at the floor below at the workers who had no idea this conversation was happening. Finally, he stood. "You can take the title," he said quietly, "but don't take the reason this company exists. It's not the name on the building. It's the people inside it." He turned to leave, but just before he reached the door, it opened. There stood Walter Dean, leaning slightly on his cane, dressed not in uniform, but in his best Sunday coat. "Mr. Dean," Lisa said in surprise, "this is a closed session." Walter smiled gently. "Then you'd better open it, ma'am, because truth don't fit well behind closed doors." The room fell silent. The hum of the projector stopped, the click of pens ceased. Only Walter's slow steps echoed as he made his way toward the table. Elliot started to speak, but Walter raised a hand. "I know what they're saying about you, son. I heard it on the radio, read it in the papers. But before you make another decision from fear, I want these folks to hear from someone who ain't wearing a suit." He faced the board, his old hands resting on the back of a chair. "I've worked for Grayson Motors 42 years, seen 3 CEOs come and go, seen good men laid off, seen bad ones promoted. But I'll tell you something, I ain't never seen a man fall and stand up honest like this one." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Walter continued, his voice steady as a church bell. "That race you all talk about, it wasn't pride that won that day. It was humility. And let me tell you, humility's a rare engine. It don't run on fuel or fame. It runs on truth." He turned to Elliot, then back to the board. "You all think he embarrassed this company." "No, ma'am. He reminded it why it was worth saving. Before him, we were just another factory. Now we're a family trying to remember its heart." Lisa's expression softened, her hands folded slowly. Walter took a breath, his voice lower now. "I've cleaned these floors, fixed your leaks, and watched this place survive recessions and greed. But if you throw away a man for learning humility in front of the world, then maybe the problem ain't him." Silence. Heavy and pure. Then unexpectedly, one of the younger board members, a woman from accounting, spoke. "He's right," she said quietly. "Our employees respect Mr. Grayson." "That's worth more than any campaign." Another nodded. "And the media storm will fade. What won't fade is how our workers feel when they clock in every day." Lisa looked around the table. "Show of hands," she said. "All in favor of reinstating Elliot Grayson as acting CEO under advisory review from this board." Hands went up slowly at first, then more. 10 of 12. Lisa smiled faintly. Motion passed. Elliot stood silent for a moment, the weight of everything pressing and then lifting all at once. He turned to Walter, his voice low. "You didn't have to do that." Walter smiled. "Sure I did. You gave me back my dignity, son. I was just returning the favor." A murmur of laughter spread across the room, soft but real. When the meeting adjourned, Lisa walked beside them toward the elevator. "Mr. Dean," she said kindly, "the company could use someone like you on the advisory board. Would you consider it?" Walter's eyebrows rose. "Never thought I'd see the day a janitor gets a seat at the big table." Elliot smiled. "You earned more than that seat." Walter chuckled, tapping his cane. "Then I'll do it, but only if the boardroom keeps coffee as good as the shop floor." They laughed. Outside, the winter air hit sharp and clean. Reporters swarmed as Elliot and Walter stepped through the glass doors, cameras flashing. Elliot started to speak, but Walter lifted a hand. "I got this." he said, smiling toward the microphones. No comment, folks. Just two men headed back to fix an old car and maybe a few broken hearts while we're at it. Laughter rippled through the crowd. For once, the cameras didn't hunger for scandal. They caught something rarer sincerity. Back in the parking lot, the red Ferrari sat beside the old Cadillac again. The sunlight caught them both, one gleaming with wealth, the other worn with years. Walter looked at Elliot. You ever think maybe God meant for us to park side by side that day? Elliot smiled. I'm starting to believe it. Walter patted the Cadillac's hood. Engines don't lie, son. They just show you what you're made of. The wind cut cold across the lot, but neither man felt it. They stood for a long moment, the old and the young, the humbled and the wise, framed by the quiet hum of a city that had finally stopped watching and started listening. And in that silence, Grayson Motors began again. Not with noise, not with power, but with the steady rhythm of something far stronger, respect. Winter had settled over Knoxville like a quiet hymn. The first flakes came early in December, not in a storm, but as if the sky was finally tired and wanted to rest. Snow collected softly on window ledges and the branches of oak trees that lined Maple Street, turning the town into a faded photograph, one that smelled of wood smoke, pine, and old memories. At Grayson Motors, the once metallic clang of machinery now carried a different rhythm, slower, steadier, almost human. The factory had changed since the summer. You could feel it in the air. Men who used to work with their heads down now laughed as they worked. Women in coveralls traded stories while measuring bolts. Even the janitors who once moved like ghosts now hummed to old country songs that played faintly from the radio perched near the tool bench. The Legacy Line program had started as a small idea. Now it was a heartbeat. Each morning, Elliot Grayson walked through the plant not as the boss everyone feared, but as someone learning how to belong. He carried no clipboard, no guard of assistants, just a mug of black coffee and the quiet patience that only came from failure. When the younger mechanics saw him, they didn't stiffen anymore. They called him by name, Elliot, not Sir. And when he made a mistake, which he often did, the laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was shared. Sometimes Walter Dean would watch him from the far end of the floor, leaning on his cane. He'd give a little nod when Elliot looked his way, the kind of nod men give when words aren't necessary. It had been 5 months since the hearing. The world outside had long forgotten the scandal. The newspapers found news stories to chase. The cameras moved on. But inside the factory, something stayed, a sense of rebuilding, not the walls, but the people. One gray Saturday morning, Elliot found himself driving aimlessly after dawn. The town was still half asleep. Chimneys whispered smoke into the air, and somewhere a church bell rang 9 slow times. Without really meaning to, he turned down Maple Street. The sign appeared like a memory: Maple Street Diner, coffee and pie since 1949. He smiled. Pulling into the same spot where everything had started months ago, the day he'd met the man who changed his life with nothing more than a wrench and a few honest words. The bell above the door chimed when he entered. Warmth hit him like a gentle wave, the smell of butter, cinnamon, and fresh coffee filling the air. Mornin' stranger, called Martha, the diner's owner, as she wiped down the counter. You look like you've seen a ghost. Elliot laughed, brushing snow from his coat. Maybe I'm visiting one. Well, Martha said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. If that ghost likes apple pie, he'll be back soon enough. He sat by the window booth, same one as before, where he'd first shared pie with Walter. The snow outside thickened, blurring the world into watercolor. For a moment, Elliot just sat and watched the quiet, watched people hurry past without realizing they were living moments worth remembering. Then the bell over the door jingled again. Walter Dean stepped inside, shoulders hunched against the cold, his old brown coat dusted with snow. He looked smaller somehow, but his eyes still held that spark, the steady blue light of a man who'd learned everything the hard way and survived anyway. Well, Walter said, grinning, I told Martha I'd only come out if she promised the pie was still warm. Looks like I came early enough to catch you too. Elliot stood to greet him. It wouldn't be Saturday without you. Walter's cane tapped softly on the floor as he crossed over and sat down. You keep talking like that, I'll start thinking you're getting sentimental. Elliot smiled. I learned it from you. Martha appeared, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. I'll get your usual Mr. Dean apple and pecan, Walter winked. You read minds, woman. She rolled her eyes and shuffled back behind the counter. For a while, the 2 men just sat in silence. The kind of silence that only comes after everything important has already been said. The snow fell harder outside, the flakes drifting past the window like ghosts of summers gone. Finally, Walter spoke. I hear that legacy line's working out better than anyone expected. Elliot nodded. It's become more than I planned. The mentorship program brought everyone together. Mechanics mentoring interns, engineers teaching high school kids. Even Lisa Harper comes by on Fridays to sit in. Walter raised an eyebrow. That fancy lady with the pearls in the jaw that could slice steel, the same one. Elliot chuckled. She's still sharp, but softer now. We all are. Walter smiled. Ain't that something? Guess the cold's good for the heart after all. The pies arrived, steaming golden crust glistening under the lights. Walter picked up his fork, cut a perfect slice, and let out a sigh that sounded like contentment itself. You know, he said between bites, I've been coming here since before you were born. Used to sit right in that booth after my shift, same seat, same pie. Back then, this place was full of folks from the plant. Your daddy used to come in, too. Elliot froze mid-sip. My father, Walter nodded. Oh, yeah. Not often, but sometimes. He'd stop by late after everyone left, just sit here and stare out that window. Once I asked him what he was thinking. You know what he said? Elliot shook his head. He said, every man builds a machine. But if he's lucky, one day he realizes the real work was building the people. The words hit Elliot like a quiet revelation, the kind that didn't make you cry but made you wish you could. He never told me that, Elliot said softly. Walter smiled sadly. That's 'cause some things a father can only say when his son's not ready to hear him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The snow outside turned heavier, the light dimming to the silver blue of afternoon. A family entered the diner, a young couple with a little boy laughing as they shook snow from their coats. The boy pressed his face to the window, leaving a foggy handprint. Elliot watched him quietly. You ever wish you could start over, Walter? Not fix the past, just live it slower. Walter sipped his coffee, eyes distant. Son, I don't think life's meant to be perfect. If it were, we'd never learn nothing. But slow. He smiled. Yeah, I think slow's the only way to live right. Outside, the light flickered as dusk arrived. Martha came over with 2 to-go cups, her smile soft. On the house, she said, for my favorite troublemakers. Walter winked. Bless you, darling. You keep making pie like that, I'll live to 100. Don't you dare, she shot back playfully. You'll eat all my apples. They laughed, and the sound mingled with the hum of the jukebox, an old Sinatra tune playing faintly in the corner. When they finally stood to leave, the diner was nearly empty. Walter reached for his scarf, slow and deliberate. Elliot helped him with the coat, an unspoken gesture between equals. Outside, the snow had thickened. The cars along Maple Street were covered in soft white layers. Walter's 1930 Cadillac sat proudly under the streetlight, every curve silvered with frost. She still runs? Elliot asked. Walter smiled. Like an old preacher, slow to start, but once she gets going, she don't quit. Elliot laughed. That's you in a nutshell. Walter tapped his cane. Nah, I just fixed the leaks. They stood side by side, breath fogging in the cold air. Across the street, Christmas lights blinked faintly in the windows of a flower shop. Somewhere down the block, a radio played Silent Night. Elliot turned to him. You ever think we'd end up here after all that? Walter shook his head. Nope. But I reckon that's what makes it worth the drive. Elliot looked up at the night sky stars hidden behind clouds, but their light still there, faint and patient. Walter, he said quietly, I never said thank you for believing in me when I didn't. Walter rested a hand on his shoulder. You already did, son. You just kept showing up. The 2 men smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried the weight of everything they'd survived. As Elliot got into his truck, Walter leaned against his Cadillac, the snow falling softly over his hat and shoulders. You remember what I told you that night at the board meeting, he called out. Elliot grinned. You said I can't fix everything at once. Walter nodded. That's right, just fix what's in front of you. And today, that's pie. Elliot laughed, shaking his head, and started the engine. The headlights carved 2 golden paths through the falling snow. He drove slowly down Maple Street, the diner's neon sign glowing behind him, a beacon in the white. And as he turned the corner, he looked in the mirror one last time. Walter was still there, one hand resting on the hood of his old Cadillac, the other lifted in a small wave. The snow kept falling thick, gentle, endless. Elliot smiled, whispering to himself, "Every man builds a machine, but the lucky ones build a life." He didn't notice the tears until they blurred the lights ahead. That night, Maple Street Diner stayed open an hour past closing. Martha wiped the counter, humming softly, watching the snow through the glass. And in that quiet town, under a Tennessee winter sky, 2 engines idled in harmony, one old, one new, both still running, both still alive. And that was enough. Spring came to Knoxville in a way only Tennessee knew how, quietly, with a kind of humble grace. The cold winds softened into a tender breeze that carried the smell of wet soil and magnolia blossoms. The sun rose earlier now, gold spilling through the factory windows at Grayson Motors, touching the steel frames and the faces of the workers who had begun their day long before the city stirred. To anyone passing by, it looked like just another car plant. But inside, something had shifted forever. The Legacy Line program had become more than policy, it had become culture. Mentors taught with stories, not manuals. Apprentices listened with hearts, not just hands. The sound of wrenches clinking was no longer mechanical but rhythmic, like a heartbeat, keeping time for a community that had rebuilt itself. And in the center of it all, Elliot Grayson moved differently now. He was still the CEO, still wore his navy suits and pressed shirts, but he no longer carried that invisible armor of pride. His words had slowed, his eyes softened. He didn't walk above anyone anymore, he walked among them. He could tell each worker's name by memory now, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Every morning before the first shift, he stopped by the photo wall beside the break room, the one lined with smiling faces of mentors and trainees. At the very center hung a framed picture in black and white, Walter Dean, hands on his hips, grease on his cheek, that old Cadillac shining behind him like a badge of time. Beneath it, a brass plate read, "He kept things running." Elliot would stand there a few moments each day, sometimes whispering a few words under his breath. Not prayers exactly, just simple things like "Morning, Walter," or "We fixed the line you used to hate." Then he'd take his coffee and start his day. It had been almost a year since the race, and nearly 2 months since Walter had passed away. That morning had been cold, but calm. Walter had parked his Cadillac in front of the Maple Street Diner, same spot as always. Martha, the owner, had seen him through the window, sitting still in the driver's seat, eyes closed like a man listening to a favorite song. By the time she went outside, he was gone, hands resting peacefully on the wheel scarf folded neatly across his lap. There had been no sirens, no panic, just quiet, the kind of departure that felt planned by heaven. When Martha called Elliot, he didn't speak. He just drove. No radio, no words. Only the road, that same road they had once taken side by side. The funeral had been small, simple, just like Walter would have wanted. The church choir sang softly. A few of the factory workers carried the casket, their hands trembling but proud. Lisa Harper stood by the door, dabbing her eyes quietly. And when it came time for words, Elliot didn't read a eulogy. He only stepped forward and said, "Walter Dean didn't just fix engines. He fixed people who'd forgotten they could still run." Nobody applauded. The silence that followed was enough. Now, weeks later, spring had covered that same churchyard with color. The air was bright and alive, birds weaving patterns above the rolling green hills. Elliot parked under the old oak tree and walked the path toward Walter's grave, his footsteps slow, careful, like he was afraid to wake the peace around him. The headstone was plain gray granite edges, smooth from fresh polish. Someone had left a coffee thermos and a slice of apple pie wrapped in foil at its base. Elliot smiled softly. "You're still getting your pie, huh?" He knelt, brushing away a few petals that had drifted down from the dogwood tree above. The inscription gleamed in the sunlight. Walter Dean, 1947-2025. He kept things running. Elliot exhaled, the kind of long, quiet breath that lets a man say more than words ever could. "Hey, old man," he said quietly. "Been a while. You'd like how things are going. Legacy Line's grown like crazy. We've got apprentices coming in from all over, even from the tech school you used to talk about. Lisa's been pushing to name the new training wing after you. The Walter Dean Workshop. Has a nice ring, doesn't it?" He smiled at the thought. Then his voice softened. I found your notebook, the one from your locker. Thought it'd be full of car parts and schematics, but in the back pages you had notes about people. Stuff like, let 'em talk first engines and men both tell you what's wrong if you listen long enough. Elliot laughed, shaking his head. You had the answers all along, and you let me stumble till I figured it out myself. Guess that's what good teachers do. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth, a Ferrari emblem, the same one that had broken off during their race months ago. He placed it gently on the grass before the headstone. You can keep that. It used to stand for speed and ego. Now it just reminds me of where I stopped and you started. The wind picked up, rustling through the branches above. The world felt bigger somehow, and lighter. Elliot stayed there a while longer, talking to the air, remembering the sound of Walter's laugh, the way he'd tap his cane twice before making a point, the way his eyes crinkled when he teased. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stood. I'll see you on the road, Walter. As he turned back toward his truck, the sky split open with light golden rays cutting through clouds like they were being peeled back just for a moment. Elliot stopped, smiled, and said softly, Yeah, I know. You're still watching. That evening, the sun set behind the hills, painting the factory windows in bronze. The hum of work had quieted, replaced by the gentle rhythm of sweeping brooms and distant laughter. In the break room, the mentorship wall had grown. New photos lined the space, framed with care. Noah Dean Walter's grandson holding a blueprint with proud, greasy fingers. Maria Lopez, the first female mentor in the welding line. Old Sam, retired mechanic teaching high school kids how to listen for misfires. And at the very top above them all, a small wooden sign carved by Elliot himself read, Keep it running, in memory of Walter Dean. Elliot stood in front of the wall that night. Noah came up beside him, wiping his hands on a rag. Mr. Grayson, he said, you really think Grandpa would have liked all this? Elliot smiled. He'd grumble, pretend it was too much. Then he'd fix something just to make it better. Noah laughed quietly. Sounds like him. Elliot turned to the young man, seeing the same quiet steadiness in his eyes that Walter once had. You got his touch, you know, not just with tools, with people. The boy blushed. I just try to do what he taught me. Elliot nodded. That's all any of us can do. They stood together, the room bathed in the golden glow of the overhead lamps. Outside, the night had deepened, and through the open windows came the faint hum of cars along the highway, a sound that once meant speed, now meaning continuity. Hey, Noah, Elliot said, after a moment. What do you think about taking the Cadillac out this weekend? Give her a little drive. Noah's eyes widened. You mean his Cadillac? Elliot smiled. Ours now. I've been keeping her tuned up. Thought maybe it's time she stretched her legs. The young man grinned. Grandpa would like that. Yeah, Elliot said softly. So would I. Sunday morning came bright and clean. The roads shimmered with dew, and the hills beyond Knoxville rolled like soft waves under the pale sun. The 1930 Cadillac purred to life, slow, deep, alive. Elliot drove Noah in the passenger seat, both wearing quiet smiles. They took the back roads winding through the countryside, passing red barns, mailboxes leaning from years of rain and fields where kids waved as they sped by. At one point, Noah reached over and turned the old radio knob. Static crackled, then a song floated through Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. The road said everything. When they finally reached Maple Street Diner, Martha was waiting outside, hands on her hips, apron dusted with flour. Well, look at that beauty, she called. She's still running, Elliot grinned. We just wanted to give her some air. Martha walked up, her eyes misting a little as she touched the car's hood. Feels like he's sitting right there with you. Noah looked down, voice soft. Maybe he is. They parked the car in Walter's old spot and went inside. Martha served them pie and coffee, same as always. Through the window, the Cadillac gleamed under the spring sun. As Elliot lifted his mug, he looked out the window and whispered, We kept it running, Walter. A warm gust brushed the glass. Just then, the diner's little bell above the door chiming faintly, though no one had come in. Martha paused, smiling softly. Guess he heard you. That night, as dusk settled over Knoxville, the factory lights of Grayson Motors shimmered like stars on the ground. The mentorship program would keep growing, more students, more teachers, more stories. The engines would hum steady as hearts long after their makers were gone. And on quiet nights when the wind moved just right across the valley, Some workers swore they could still hear the low rumble of an old Cadillac engine passing down Maple Street. Never rushing, never fading, just rolling steady toward home. Because some stories don't end. They just keep running. Sometimes life's greatest journeys don't end with thunder or applause. They end in quiet miles under soft skies when the heart finally learns to slow down. Elliot's road began with pride and ended with peace. Walter's hands built more than engines. They built a bridge between what was broken and what could still be made whole. The old Cadillac still hums down Maple Street every Sunday morning, carrying memories of two men who learned that forgiveness, like a well-tuned motor, needs both patience and care. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not power, not success, but the simple grace of starting over. Like a porch light left on after supper, kindness can guide someone home even after years of darkness. We've all known days when we ran too fast, when we lost sight of what really mattered, but sometimes a single act of compassion can change the whole route of our lives. Because love and redemption aren't grand gestures, they're the everyday choices that make us human, sharing coffee at dawn, checking on a neighbor, forgiving someone who once failed us. Just as Walter taught Elliot, it's never too late to rebuild, to hand someone the tools they need to fix not just a car, but a heart. So if tonight you find yourself thinking about the people who once stood beside you, maybe give them a call. Sit down at that same kitchen table, pour a cup of warm coffee, and talk a little longer. After all, happiness doesn't come from how far we go. It comes from who's still waiting when we finally come home. Like that quiet light glowing from the diner window, goodness never shouts. It just stays on steady, patient, and bright enough to lead us through the storm. If this story touched your heart, press 1 in the comments, or 0 if there's something you'd change. Either way, thank you for listening, and may your road tonight be gentle, your home warm, and your heart still running steady.